My video literature review will be focusing on Project Muse by Mary Elise Surratt. Mary Elise Surratt opens 1989 with the reminder that there was nothing at all inevitable about what followed. The end of the Cold War is often remembered as being a clean and triumphant end, but Surratt insists that the political climate, the diplomatic climate, and the social landscape of 1989 to 1990 was chaotic and largely undecided. Her central claim is that Europe's post-Cold War order emerged not through master planning, but through fast-moving competition between four incompatible models for Europe's future, each pushed forward by different actors operating under different pressures. So I'm going to attempt to situate Surratt's work within four major scholarly debates about the end of the Cold War and evaluate how her archival findings reshape the historiography. I will show how her emphasis on contingency, institutional path dependence, and the structural exclusion of Russia aligns and diverges from key works from Mark Trachtenberg, Joshua Schifferson, James Gouldier, and the H. Diplo Roundtable on Christina Sfore's Post-Wall, Post-Square. I will also try and weave in some additional historical context from the book about the protests, the German elections, NATO debates, the crucial diplomacy of 1990, and then how it applies to contemporary politics. So there are three main scholarly debates, and these scholarly debates fall into three broad camps. So A, the realist and power-based explanations. So essentially that material power determines the outcome. People like John Lewis Gaddis, who described the West victory as a culmination of containment. Mark Trachtenberg, who we'll talk about a bit a bit later on, who argued that German unification is a result of great power bargaining and not protest ideology. And then Zubak, who emphasizes the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. Essentially, this camp argues that the Western order prevailed because the West could dictate the terms. And this argument does resonate a bit with history and elements of 1990. So the Soviet troops still numbered 380,000 in East Germany, yet their government was near bankrupt, and they were unable to subsidize its empire and facing pressures from a democratizing Eastern Europe. And this determined the Soviet troops to be pushed out. The second camp is the liberal order. So this is just institutionalists that focus on durability and attractiveness of Western institutions. This is somewhat reminiscent of Surratt's observation. She says that the fact that both the EC and NATO were structurally capable of expansion provided useful precedents. That comes directly from her book. So once NATO and the EC existed as functioning prestige-laden bodies, expanding them was the easiest and fastest solution. And then the final camp is contingency and leadership. And this camp highlights miscommunication, improvisation, bottom-up mobilization, diplomatic maneuvering, and the collapse of state capacity in Eastern Europe. So Surratt's key point is that change to the existing order was once again possible in 1989. The school rejects deterministic narratives and emphasizes how easily events could have turned out differently. So Surratt's argument herself, the argument she makes herself is through, she makes it through archival documents, interviews, recently declassified notes, and her story kind of unfolds in six main claims. The first is that 1989 to 1990 was open, fluid, and a contested moment. She shows that the events unfolded quite quickly. So the East German collapse is the first in the fall of 1989. The Monday demonstrations swelled from 70,000 to 300,000. Opposition groups pushed for reform while the SED regime froze, and they were unable to decide whether to repress or to negotiate. And Western TV crews broadcast police movements live, deterring violence. She focuses quite a bit on media coverage. She writes that East Europeans now knew that the USSR was unwilling to pay the bloody costs necessary to crush them. Surratt reconstructed the November 9th press conference where SED spokesperson Schabowski, confused by briefing notes, announced new travel rules effective immediately, and crowds surged. Border guards deprived of instructions, phone superiors in panic, and live cameras pressured them to avoid firing. And she writes that television and radio broadcasts may fairly be given credit for finally opening the Berlin Wall. So the wall fell through miscommunication, media pressure, and regime paralysis, and not grand strategy. She says again, the East German street had brought down the wall with the help of the media. So the 4 competing models for Europe's future. So she uses this architectural metaphor. Europe in 1990 was a construction site with 4 blueprints. 1, the Soviet restoration model. So a version of the 1945 4-power control, and it failed because the USSR no longer had the coercive or financial capacity in enforcing it. The second, the German revitalist confederation model. So Kohl initially proposed a loose national confederation of 2 German states, but the unrest pace quickly outstripped this model. It was too cautious. Third, Gorbachev's heroic multinational model, the common European home. It was vague, slow, and institutionally weak, but it had a strong vision. Strout writes that the heroic model proved to be illusory or misguided. And then there's the Western prefab model. This is what ended up prevailing. So it extended existing Western institutions eastward, so NATO, EC, Deutsche Mark, Basic Law, the West German Constitution. She describes it as proven structures to be put in place by proven politicians. And this model was successful largely because it was fast, familiar, they were ready institutionally, it was electorally legitimized and financially backed. So kind of to continue on the prefab model, German domestic politics accelerated this model. So Kohl's 10-point plan signaled rapid unification. The March 1990 East German elections handed Kohl's allies a decisive victory. The public demanded immediate union with West Germany and the Deutsche Mark. And the currency union decision in July 1990 turned the DM into the Deutsche Mark into the anchor of unification. So then there's Kohl-Bush coordination. Surratt highlights the unusually close personal coordination between Kohl and Bush, including they had daily secure phone calls, mutual commitments to ensure unity with NATO, and a joint strategy for handling Gorbachev. Additionally, we have U.S.-Soviet diplomacy, so the Malta Summit in 1989, where Bush reassured Gorbachev, that he needed to avoid triumphalism. Baker-Gorbachev meetings in February 1990, where the not 1 inch eastward phrase was first came up. Washington Summit of May and June 1990, Gorbachev concessions on German NATO's membership, and then the caucus meetings in July of 1990. Kohl offered major financial aid. Gorbachev agreed to full German sovereignty. So the prefab model succeeded because it aligned with the political speed of Germany at the time, American strategic clarity, and Soviet weakness, as well as East German electoral preferences. So the consequences of this is that Russia ended up structurally excluded. Surratt argues that the prefab model extended Western institutions into Eastern Europe without creating a place for Russia. She says that there was no clear place carved out for Russia and that the opportunity was lost. She stresses that this is not intentional hostility, but it was an accidental result of speed, institutional path dependence, and a lack of alternative methods. She warns that extending Cold War structures was a quick fix, but these structures could not easily be recast to accommodate the great enemy, the Slavic other. So this is kind of where I'll go into the other arguments. Her work begins to intersect with today's NATO-Russia tensions. So I have Mark Trachtenberg's argument. His international security article reopens the question about newly declassified evidence, and he shows that Baker told Gorbachev NATO's jurisdiction would not move 1 inch to the east. Genscher publicly declared NATO would not expand not only to the GDR, but to all other Eastern countries. Soviet leaders left these meetings believing that they had received broad political assurances. Trachtenberg argues that these were not binding promises because they were never formalized, but insists that the Soviets reasonably expected restraint, that assurances applied to Eastern Europe, all the assurances applied to Eastern Europe as a whole. And Surratt agrees partially with this. She writes that Western leaders repeatedly affirmed that NATO would not move eastward at all, but she emphasizes that Gorbachev never got the West to promise that it would freeze NATO's borders. So both of them, Surratt and Trachtenberg, argue that diplomacy in the early 1990s was ambiguous and easily misunderstood, and this ambiguity sowed long-term distrust. Trachtenberg pushes harder on how broad the assurances were, whereas Surratt highlights that they were not institutionalized. But together, their work shows how post-Cold War order was fragile and conflicting. The interpretations were conflicting, that is, and that is a theme which reinforces Surratt's contingency argument. Then we have Joshua Schifferson's critique. So Schifferson argues that U.S. policy antagonized Russia on vital issues while engaging it only on secondary matters, and that Washington bypassed Russia's two key interests, equal influence in Europe and a security buffer. He concludes that NATO's enlargement made a future East-West rupture likely. Both Surratt and Schifferson argued that Russia was structurally included, that the post-Cold War order left Moscow on the outside looking in. And finally, that diplomatic choices in 1989 to 1992 shaped today's conflict. The differences were that Surratt's claims that exclusion was an inadvertent result of institutional momentum, and Schifferson states that exclusion was a strategic choice. So Schifferson argues that NATO expansion directly contributed to today's Russia-Ukraine war, and it extends Surratt's argument into the contemporary stage of geopolitics. So finally, I would like to touch on the H. Diplo Roundtable on SFOR's post-wall, post-square, and this roundtable reinforces core themes in Surratt. I want to check my time. Oh, I'm running out. Okay. I might just go through this quickly then. But essentially, a lot of the points from Radchenko, Bergman, Kalinowski, and Zelkov reinforce Surratt's claim that early institutional choices created durable but rigid structures, early decisions created structural tensions, and that the architecture itself contained the seeds of later crises. So I'll go into my conclusion. Surratt writes that in 1989 to 1990, the final round in a competition that was long-running, multi-layered, and profoundly significant, her broader argument is that the Cold War did not end with inevitability, but through rapid, improvised choices, and that the Western prefab model triumphed because it was fast and institutionally ready, not because it was historically destined. And once implemented, the model created a stable Western Europe, but left Russia structurally outside the order. So her final warning, once the foundation is laid, facts on the ground are difficult to change. And in this sense, Surratt, Trachtenberg, Schifferson, and the H. Diplo Roundtable converge on a shared conclusion that the world today was shaped decisively by the contingent, hurried, and largely ambiguous decisions made between 1989 and 1992. The debates of that period about NATO, sovereignty, security guarantees, and institutional design have now animated the crisis in Ukraine, the standoff between NATO and Russia, and the fragility of the European security architecture. Project Muse returns to her central claim that they were contingent, shaped by improvision, accident, institutional path dependence, and that there was nothing inevitable about what followed. She uses 3 episodes, not only as historical narrative, but as evidence for her broader theoretical point. The end of the Cold War did not follow the logic predicted by realism, liberal institutionalism, or democratic transition theory. Instead, it emerged through a multi-layered competition of models with uneven capacity and vastly different timelines. Her conclusion emphasized the normative power of the factual. So once the prefab Western model was installed, it became very, very difficult to change. It also highlights a second major argument that the architecture created a Western order with no structural place for Russia, not through malice, but through institutional momentum and political urgency. She continues to stress that there was no clear place or no clear place carved out for Russia, and that there was a lost opportunity, and that key institutions extended eastward, like NATO, EC, Deutsche Mark, Basic Law, were Cold War creations designed against the Soviet Union. So this structural mismatch is why, according to her, that even leaders acting in good faith laid the foundations of future resentment. Her chapters return to the problem that the fastest available solution could not be easily recast to accommodate the great enemy, the Slavic other. And largely the Muse framing is that the tragedy is not that the leaders chose the wrong model, but rather the model was the only model capable of stabilization could not simultaneously sustain a cooperative relationship with the collapsing Soviet Union. So the overall arching message or insight in the book is that the post-Cold War order is not only a story about what was built, but about what was left structurally impossible.